The diamond ring wasn't mine. I stood in the marble foyer of our Harbor Hills penthouse, holding the small velvet box that had tumbled from David's suit pocket when I'd taken his jacket to the dry cleaner. The emerald-cut stone caught the Seattle afternoon light streaming through our floor-to-ceiling windows, casting tiny rainbows across my trembling fingers. For my darling V, forever yours, D. The engraving inside the platinum band made my stomach lurch. V, not M for Maya. And definitely not the simple gold band David had placed on my finger 9 years ago during our courthouse wedding, back when we were young and broke and thought love was enough to conquer anything. My name is Maya Chen Sterling, though I'd been thinking of dropping the Sterling part for months now. At 34, I'm the CEO of Sterling Occasions, Seattle's most exclusive event planning company. I've orchestrated weddings for tech billionaires, corporate galas, for Fortune 500 companies, and charity fundraisers that have raised millions for causes I believe in. I'm the woman who can coordinate 1,000 moving pieces into perfect harmony, who never misses a detail, who prides herself on seeing everything. How had I missed this? I sank onto our Italian leather sofa, the same one David had insisted we buy last year, despite my protests about the cost. "We can afford it now," he'd said, wrapping his arms around me in that way that used to make me feel safe. "We've both worked so hard. We deserve beautiful things." The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now discovering his betrayal while sitting on furniture that had probably been purchased with money intended for another woman. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Working late again tonight. Morrison case is heating up. Don't wait up. Love you, love you." The casual cruelty of those 2 words hit me like a physical blow. How long had he been lying? How long had working late meant something else entirely? I forced myself to think systematically the way I approached complex events. David Sterling, 36 years old, senior associate at Morrison & Associates, one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms. Born into old money, educated at Yale, the kind of man who wore his privilege so naturally he never had to think about it. He'd been my Prince Charming, the sophisticated lawyer who'd fallen for the scrappy event planner with calloused hands and a chip on her shoulder. We'd met at a charity gala I was coordinating for the Children's Hospital Foundation. I was 25, running on 3 hours of sleep and pure adrenaline when the centerpiece for the head table collapsed 20 minutes before the first guests arrived. I was on my hands and knees among scattered orchids and broken crystal when a pair of expensive Italian shoes appeared in my line of vision. "Looks like you could use some help," a warm voice had said. I'd looked up to find the most beautiful man I'd ever seen, not just handsome. Beautiful in that effortless way that comes from generations of good genetics and better nutrition. Dark hair, green eyes, and a smile that made me forget I was covered in potting soil and floral foam. "Unless you have a degree in emergency flower arrangement, I don't think there's much you can do," I'd replied more sharply than I'd intended. 9 years of dragging myself out of poverty had taught me to be suspicious of men who looked like they'd never worked a day in their lives. But David had surprised me. He'd taken off his $1,000 jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and spent the next 15 minutes helping me rebuild that centerpiece. More than that, he'd made me laugh while we worked turning a disaster into something that felt almost like fun. "I'm David Sterling," he'd said when we finished, his hands dirty but his smile unchanged. "And you're remarkable." I'd fallen for him completely. Looking back now, I wondered if that had always been the plan. The buzzing of my phone pulled me back to the present. A call from my assistant Claire. I let it go to voicemail, then immediately felt guilty. Sterling Occasions was my life's work built from nothing after my parents lost everything to a financial scam when I was 21. Every client, every successful event, every 5-star review represented another step away from the poverty and instability that had defined my childhood. But right now, I couldn't focus on orchid varieties or seeding charts. I needed to understand what was happening to my marriage. I walked to David's home office, a masculine sanctuary of dark wood and leather that he'd claimed as his own when we'd moved into this place 3 years ago. "I need somewhere to think," he'd said. "Somewhere that's just mine." I'd understood. The penthouse was beautiful, but cold, all clean lines and expensive art chosen by the interior designer David's mother had insisted we hire. It didn't feel like home to either of us, but David had wanted to live up to his family's expectations, and I'd wanted to make him happy. Now I stood in the doorway of his private space, feeling like an intruder in my own home. The massive mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface meticulously organized. David's law degree hung on the wall next to a photo of us from our wedding day, young hopeful, completely unaware of what was coming. I moved to his desk, my heart pounding. Searching through your husband's belongings felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross, but the ring burning in my palm demanded answers. The first drawer held the usual suspects' pens, business cards, breath mints. The second contained legal documents, all related to cases I recognized from his dinner conversation. But the third drawer was locked. I stared at the small brass lock, my mind racing. In 9 years of marriage, David had never locked anything away from me. We'd shared everything: bank accounts, passwords, dreams. Or so I'd thought. The key wasn't in any of the obvious places, not taped under the drawer, not hidden behind the picture frames, not in the pencil holder. But as I was about to give up my fingers, found it tucked behind one of his law books. A slim volume on matrimonial law that seemed oddly out of place, given that David specialized in corporate litigation. The locked drawer slid open to reveal a life I didn't recognize. Hotel receipts from the Fairmont Olympic dated over the past 6 months. Dinner receipts from restaurants I'd never been to, always for 2 people, always on nights when David had claimed to be working late. A business card for a jewelry store in Pioneer Square. Emerald Bay Jewelry, the same name from the ring's receipt. But it was the photograph that made my hands shake. David and a woman I didn't recognize standing on the deck of a yacht I'd never seen. Her long, dark hair caught the wind as she laughed at something he'd said, and his arm was wrapped around her waist with casual intimacy. She was beautiful in a way that made my chest tighten, young, polished with the kind of effortless elegance that comes from never having to worry about money. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Victoria and David, our future begins now," in handwriting I didn't recognize. Victoria, V, the woman who'd received the diamond ring. I sank into David's chair, the leather still warm from the afternoon sun, and tried to process what I was looking at. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, a drunken mistake at a company party. This was a relationship, a future, a whole life that existed parallel to ours. My phone rang again. This time it was my brother Alex, and I knew I had to answer. Alex Chen was the only family I had left, and he worried about me constantly, especially since our parents had died in a car accident 2 years ago. "Maya, you sound weird. Everything okay?" I looked at the photograph in my hand at my husband's arm around another woman and tried to find words that wouldn't make this real. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired." "You work too much. When's the last time you and David did something fun together?" The question hit me like a slap. When was the last time I couldn't remember? Somewhere along the way, we'd stopped being a couple and become business partners managing the enterprise of our marriage. David handled the finances, I handled our social calendar, and we'd both been too busy to notice that we'd stopped actually talking to each other. "We're having dinner tomorrow night," I heard myself say. "Anniversary planning." It wasn't true. Our anniversary was still 2 weeks away, and we hadn't made any plans. But Alex sounded relieved, and I wasn't ready to admit that my marriage might be falling apart. After I hung up, I sat in David's chair and forced myself to really look at our life together. The penthouse, with its perfect furnishings and lack of warmth, the separate schedules that rarely overlapped, the conversations that had become increasingly perfunctory, focused on logistics rather than dreams. How long had we been living like polite strangers? I thought about the sapphire necklace, my great-great-grandmother's most precious possession. Li Mei had brought it with her when she'd emigrated from China in 1892, a young woman with nothing but hope and a small velvet pouch containing the jewelry that represented her family's lost fortune. 4 generations of Chen women had worn that necklace during their most difficult moments. My great-grandmother during the Depression, my grandmother when she'd buried her husband. My mother, when she'd fought to keep our family together after the financial scandal that had destroyed my father's business. 6 months ago, David had convinced me to let him store the necklace in his office safe. "It's not secure here," he'd said, gesturing around our penthouse. "Too many people have access. Cleaning staff, building maintenance. At the firm, it'll be completely protected." Now I wondered if it was even still there. The thought sent me rushing to our bedroom, to the small jewelry box where I kept my everyday pieces. The sapphire necklace was gone, of course, but so was something else. A pair of diamond earrings David had given me for our 5th anniversary. The box felt too light, too empty. I was starting to understand that this wasn't just about an affair. This was about theft. My laptop was on the bed where I'd left it that morning while reviewing contracts for an upcoming corporate retreat. I opened it with shaking fingers and navigated to our joint bank accounts using the passwords David and I had shared since we'd combined our finances. The first account looked normal. The second showed a concerning pattern of withdrawals over the past 4 months, always in round numbers, always transferred to an account I didn't recognize. The third account, the one containing the bulk of our savings money I'd earned through years of building sterling occasions, had been systematically drained. $300,000. Gone. I stared at the screen, watching the cursor blink in the empty balance field, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. The hurt and confusion were still there, but they were being overtaken by something colder and more dangerous. Anger. David hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He'd stolen my life's work, the security I'd built from nothing after watching my parents lose everything. He'd taken the money I'd earned through 18-hour days and weekend events, through careful planning and strategic networking, through all the sacrifices I'd made to build something lasting. And he'd given it to another woman. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Jake Morrison had been recommended by a client whose husband had been embezzling from their family business. "He's expensive," she'd warned me, "but he's the best, and more importantly, he's discreet." Jake Morrison, private investigator. Former Seattle PD detective now specializing in matrimonial cases and corporate fraud. I'd never thought I'd need his services. The phone rang 3 times before a gravelly voice answered. "Morrison." "Mr. Morrison, this is Maya Chen Sterling. I need your help." There was a pause, and I could hear the sounds of traffic in the background. "What kind of help, Mrs. Sterling?" I looked at the photograph of David and Victoria, at the empty bank accounts on my laptop screen, at the jewelry box with its missing treasures. "I think my husband is having an affair," I said, "and I think he's been stealing from me to pay for it." "Okay," Jake said, his voice professionally neutral. "How much do you know?" "Not enough," I replied, "but I'm going to find out everything." After we'd arranged to meet the next morning, I sat in our bedroom, David's and my bedroom, where we'd made love and shared dreams and planned a future that apparently only I had believed in, and tried to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. The diamond ring was just the beginning. The hotel receipts, the drained bank accounts, the missing jewelry. It all pointed to a systematic betrayal that had been going on for months, maybe longer. But there was something else bothering me, something that went beyond the personal devastation. David was a corporate lawyer specializing in mergers and acquisitions. He made good money, but not enough to fund the kind of lifestyle these receipts suggested. The yacht in the photo, the jewelry from Emerald Bay, the repeated stays at Seattle's most expensive hotel. Where was all this money coming from? I thought about Morrison & Associates, the prestigious firm where David had worked for the past 5 years. Founded by Richard Morrison, it was old money Seattle at its finest, the kind of place where partnerships were inherited rather than earned, and where the client list read like a who's who of Pacific Northwest wealth. David had been desperate to make partner there, working 80-hour weeks and taking on increasingly high-profile cases. "Once I make partner," he'd tell me, "we'll have the security we've always wanted. We can start a family, buy a house outside the city, maybe even take a real vacation." But what if David had found a shortcut to that security? What if he wasn't just stealing from me? The thought was too big, too frightening to fully process. I needed facts, not speculation. I needed Jake Morrison's expertise and resources. But first, I needed to survive dinner with my husband. David came home at 9:30, carrying takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant and wearing the smile that had once made my heart skip. He found me in the living room, ostensibly reading a book, but actually staring at the same page for the past hour. "Sorry I'm so late," he said, setting the food on our granite kitchen counter. "The Morrison case is turning into a nightmare. Richard has us working around the clock." He moved with easy familiarity through our kitchen-opening wine-plating food, talking about his day as if nothing had changed, as if he hadn't been systematically dismantling our life together for months. "How was your day?" he asked, settling onto the sofa beside me with our plates. I looked at him, really looked, and tried to see the man I'd fallen in love with. The generous stranger who'd helped me rebuild a floral arrangement, the ambitious young lawyer who'd supported my dream of starting my own business, the husband who'd held me through my parents' funeral and promised we'd face everything together. But all I could see was the man in the photograph, his arm around another woman planning a future that didn't include me. "Fine," I said, accepting the plate he offered. "Busy. The Hartwell wedding is next weekend, so we're in full preparation mode." "That's the tech guy, right? The one with the unlimited budget." "Mm-hmm." I forced myself to take a bite of pad thai, though it tasted like sawdust. "What about you? Tell me about this case that's keeping you so busy." And David launched into a detailed explanation of some corporate acquisition using legal terminology I didn't understand and didn't care about, but I listened carefully, watching his face, looking for tells. Was this where he practiced his lies? Was every story about late nights at the office really a cover for time spent with Victoria? "David," I said during a pause in his monologue, "do you ever miss how things used to be between us?" He looked surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "When we were younger, when we talked about everything, when we used to stay up all night planning our future." Something flickered across his face. Guilt, regret. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "We're not kids anymore, Maya," he said gently. "We have responsibilities now, careers. This is what adult marriage looks like." The dismissiveness in his tone stung more than any direct insult could have. This is what adult marriage looks like. As if I was naive for wanting connection, immature for missing intimacy. "I suppose you're right," I said, and saw him relax slightly. We finished dinner in relative silence, David checking his phone periodically with the kind of secretive attention I now recognized as telling. When he excused himself to take a work call, I heard him talking in low, warm tones that sounded nothing like business conversation. That night, I lay awake listening to David's steady breathing and planning my next moves. Tomorrow, I would meet with Jake Morrison and begin the systematic investigation that would either save my marriage or end it. Tonight, I would memorize the weight of my husband's body beside me, the sound of his breathing, the familiar scent of his cologne. Because I was beginning to understand that no matter what Jake discovered, the man I'd loved for 9 years was already gone. The last thing I thought before sleep finally claimed me was a memory from my childhood. My grandmother's voice telling me the story of the sapphire necklace. "Strength runs in our family," she'd said, fastening the clasp around my 12-year-old neck. "But sometimes we have to fight for it. Sometimes we have to take it back from people who think we're too weak to defend ourselves." I touched my throat, missing the familiar weight of the sapphires, and made a silent promise to the generations of Chen women who'd worn that necklace through their darkest moments. I was going to get it back, and I was going to make sure David Sterling learned exactly how strong a Chen woman could be when someone made the mistake of underestimating her. Jake Morrison's office occupied the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in Georgetown, Seattle's industrial district. The building's exterior was all exposed brick and steel beams, while the interior had been transformed into a maze of artist studios, tech startups, and what Jake called discreet professional services. I climbed the stairs at exactly 9 a.m., wearing my most conservative business suit and carrying a leather portfolio that contained every piece of evidence I'd discovered. My hands weren't shaking anymore. Somewhere between finding that diamond ring and falling asleep to the sound of my husband's lies, I'd crossed a line that had transformed devastation into determination. Jake Morrison looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for a private investigator, mid-40s, graying at the temples, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen every variety of human betrayal. His office was sparse but efficient, dominated by a massive desk covered in case files and computer equipment that looked more advanced than anything I'd seen outside of tech companies. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Coffee, please." I settled into the chair and opened my portfolio. I should start by saying I've never done anything like this before. "Most people haven't," Jake replied, returning with 2 steaming mugs. "That's usually what makes them such easy targets. Tell me what you found." I laid out the evidence methodically, the diamond ring, the hotel receipts, the photograph, the empty bank accounts. Jake examined each item with the detached professionalism of a surgeon occasionally making notes in a leather-bound notebook. "How long do you think this has been going on?" he asked. "Based on the receipts, at least 6 months. But honestly, I think I've been willfully blind for longer than that." The admission stung, but it was true. David's been distant for almost a year. Different schedule, less communication, just absent even when he was home. Jake nodded. Classic pattern. The emotional withdrawal usually starts months before the physical affair. "What made you finally investigate?" I told him about the ring, about the systematic emptying of our savings accounts, about the missing jewelry, including my family's sapphire necklace. As I spoke, Jake's expression grew more serious. "Mrs. Sterling, what you're describing sounds like more than a simple affair. This level of financial manipulation suggests something more systematic, more professional." "What do you mean?" "I mean, your husband might not be acting alone. The amount of money involved, the sophisticated financial transfers, the careful documentation. This looks like matrimonial fraud. It's a specialty practice among certain unethical lawyers." The words hit me like cold water. Matrimonial fraud. Lawyers who help wealthy clients systematically strip assets from their spouses before filing for divorce. They create complex financial structures, move money offshore, sometimes even manufacture evidence of spousal instability to strengthen their cases. It's highly illegal, but it's also highly profitable. I stared at him, trying to process this new dimension of betrayal. "You think David is planning to divorce me?" "I think David is planning to leave you with nothing," Jake said bluntly. "The question is whether he's developed this expertise on his own or whether he's working with others who specialize in this kind of fraud." I thought about Morrison and Associates, about the prestigious client list and the old money connections, about David's desperation to make partner and his sudden change in behavior over the past year. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Access to your joint accounts, credit reports, any business records that might show financial irregularities. I'll need to trace every transaction, identify patterns, and figure out where the money is going. Most importantly, I'll need to document everything in a way that will hold up in court." "You think this will end up in court?" Jake's expression was grim. "Mrs. Sterling, if what I suspect is true, this won't just end up in family court. This will be federal fraud charges. Your husband and his associates could be looking at serious prison time." I left Jake's office with a list of documents to gather and a timeline for investigation. 1 week to compile financial records, 2 weeks for Jake to conduct surveillance and trace assets, and then we'd reassess based on what we'd learned. But first, I had to survive another week of living with David, pretending everything was normal, while systematically gathering evidence of his betrayal. That afternoon, I threw myself into work with desperate intensity. Sterling Occasions was in the final preparation phase for the Hartwell wedding, a 3-day extravaganza for a tech billionaire's daughter that had taken 6 months to plan. The ceremony would be held at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, the same hotel where David had been taking Victoria according to the receipts I'd found. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I was orchestrating someone else's fairy tale beginning, I was documenting the end of my own. "Maya, you've been staring at that seating chart for 20 minutes, my assistant Claire observed from the doorway of my office. The Hartwell table arrangements were finalized last week. I looked up, realizing I'd been completely lost in thought. Claire Kim was my right hand at Sterling Occasions, a brilliant 26-year-old with a degree in hospitality management and an intuitive understanding of what made events memorable. More than that, she'd become a friend, someone I trusted with both professional crises and personal anxieties. "Sorry," I said, closing the laptop. "My mind is elsewhere today." Claire closed the office door and settled into the chair across from my desk. "Want to talk about it?" For a moment, I was tempted to tell her everything. Claire was smart, loyal, and discreet. She'd helped me navigate difficult clients and family dramas before. But something held me back. Maybe the need to protect what was left of my privacy, or maybe the fear that saying it out loud would make it too real. "David and I are going through a rough patch," I said finally. "It's nothing that can't be worked out, but it's distracting." Claire studied my face with the kind of attention she usually reserved for fabric swatches and menu tastings. "Maya, I've known you for 3 years. You don't do rough patches. You fix problems. If you're this distracted, something serious is wrong." Before I could respond, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen and I felt my stomach clench. "I should take this," I told Claire, who nodded and left the office. "Hi," I said, forcing warmth into my voice. "Hey, beautiful. How's the Hartwell chaos?" Beautiful. When was the last time he'd called me that? And why did it sound so automatic now, like muscle memory rather than genuine affection? "Manageable," I said. "What's up?" "I'm going to be late again tonight. Richard wants the Morrison team to work through some new developments. Rain check on dinner." Rain check on dinner? As if we'd actually made plans, as if my schedule mattered enough to consult before canceling. "Of course," I said. "Work comes first." "You're the best, Maya. I don't know what I'd do without you." The casual cruelty of that statement took my breath away. He was about to find out exactly what he'd do without me, though not in the way he expected. After I hung up, I opened my laptop and began the systematic review of our financial records that Jake had requested. What I found was even worse than I'd feared. The pattern of asset transfer wasn't random. It was methodical, sophisticated, and designed to be nearly invisible to a casual observer. Money moved from our joint savings into investment accounts I'd never heard of then, into shell companies with innocuous names, then into overseas accounts beyond the reach of American courts. David hadn't just been stealing from me. He'd been preparing for this for at least a year. But as I dug deeper into the financial records, I found something that made my blood run cold. The sophisticated financial structures, the shell companies, the offshore accounts, they weren't unique to our situation. Similar patterns appeared in documentation for other Morrison & Associates clients, all of them involving wealthy spouses and contentious divorces. This wasn't just about David and Victoria. This was about Morrison & Associates running a systematic operation to help wealthy clients defraud their spouses. I printed everything and locked it in my office safe, then called Jake Morrison. "I found something," I said when he answered. "Something big. Can you bring it to the office?" "Not over the phone," I said, "and not at your office. David might be having me watched." There was a pause. "You're learning to think like an investigator, Mrs. Sterling. Meet me at the Starbucks on Pine Street in an hour. Bring everything." I arrived early and claimed a table in the back corner, away from windows and foot traffic. Jake appeared exactly on time, looking like any other business casual professional grabbing afternoon coffee. He sat across from me without acknowledgement, and I slid a manila envelope across the table. He opened it discreetly, scanning the financial documents I'd compiled. I watched his expression change from professional interest to genuine concern. "Mrs. Sterling," he said quietly, "do you understand what you've found here? I think Morrison & Associates is running some kind of organized fraud operation." More than that, this is a pattern that spans multiple cases, multiple victims, millions of dollars in transfers. If this documentation is accurate, we're looking at a federal racketeering case. The magnitude of what he was saying settled over me like cold water. What does that mean for me? It means you're not just David's wife anymore. You're a witness to a major criminal conspiracy, and that makes you potentially very dangerous to some very powerful people." Jake's words echoed in my mind as I drove home that evening. The penthouse felt different now, contaminated by knowledge of David's betrayal, but also by the understanding that I was living with a criminal. Not just an unfaithful husband, but someone involved in systematic fraud that had destroyed other families. David was already home when I arrived, which was unusual for a weeknight. He was cooking. Actually cooking, not heating up takeout. And the smell of garlic and wine filled the kitchen. "Surprise," he said, gesturing to the elaborate meal he was preparing. "I felt bad about canceling dinner last night, so I thought I'd make it up to you." I stared at him, this handsome man in his expensive shirt and designer jeans, casually preparing ossobuco, as if he hadn't spent the day conspiring to destroy my life. "This is wonderful," I managed. "What's the occasion? Do I need an occasion to cook for my wife?" The word sounded strange coming from him now, like a role he was trying on rather than a relationship he cherished. Over dinner, David was more attentive than he'd been in months. He asked about sterling occasions, complimented the wine pairing I'd chosen, even suggested we plan a weekend getaway after the Hartwell wedding was finished. "Maybe somewhere warm," he said, refilling my wine glass. "The Caribbean or maybe Hawaii, somewhere we can just relax and reconnect." I nodded and smiled, playing the part of the grateful wife, while wondering if this sudden attention was guilt or strategy. Was he trying to assuage his conscience, or was he setting up some final manipulation before disappearing with Victoria and my money? "David," I said, setting down my fork, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you happy, really happy with our life together?" He paused his wine glass halfway to his lips. "That's a loaded question." "I'm serious. Sometimes I feel like we're just going through the motions. Like we're business partners managing our lives rather than people who chose to build a future together." For a moment, something real flickered across his face. Regret, maybe, or sadness, but it was gone so quickly, I might have imagined it. "Marriage is work, Maya," he said finally. "It's not always going to feel like it did when we were 25, but that doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for." Fighting for? As if he was the one trying to save our relationship, rather than the one systematically destroying it. That night, I lay awake listening to David's breathing and planning my next moves. Jake's investigation would take time, but I couldn't wait passively for results. I needed to understand the full scope of what David and Morrison and Associates were doing, and I needed to protect myself in case they realized I was investigating. The next morning, I called my brother Alex. Alex Chen was a forensic accountant specializing in financial fraud investigations for law enforcement and private clients. At 31, he was 3 years younger than me, but infinitely more sophisticated about complex financial crimes. If anyone could help me understand the true scope of what I'd discovered, it was Alex. "Maya!" He sounded surprised to hear from me so early. "Everything okay? I need your help with something confidential." There was a pause. "What kind of help?" "The financial kind. Can you meet me for lunch today?" We met at a small Vietnamese restaurant in the International District, the kind of place where Alex and I had eaten with our parents when we were kids. Alex arrived looking concerned, his usually neat appearance slightly disheveled, as if he'd rushed from another appointment. "You sounded strange on the phone," he said, settling into the booth across from me. "What's going on?" I'd prepared for this conversation, but actually having it proved more difficult than I'd expected. Alex had always looked up to David, admiring his professional success and social connections. Telling him about the affair was hard enough. Explaining the financial fraud felt like dismantling his understanding of who David really was. But Alex was family, and I needed his expertise. I told him everything, laying out the evidence methodically and watching his expression change from confusion to concern to professional anger. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Maya," he said finally, "this is seriously bad, not just personally but legally. If David is involved in this kind of systematic fraud, he's looking at federal charges. And if Morrison and Associates is running this as an organized operation—" "I know, Jake Morrison thinks it might be a RICO case." Jake Morrison is right. Maya, you need to understand that you could be in real danger here. People have been killed for less than what you've uncovered. The words hit me like a physical blow. Killed? Think about it. You're talking about millions of dollars, powerful clients, respected attorneys. If this becomes public, it won't just destroy careers. It'll destroy lives, families, entire social networks. People with that much to lose can be very dangerous when they feel cornered. I stared at my brother, this soft-spoken accountant who dealt with numbers and spreadsheets, talking calmly about the possibility that my husband might be involved with people who could hurt me. "What do I do?" I asked. "You document everything, you work with law enforcement, and you protect yourself. Do you have somewhere safe to stay if you need to leave quickly?" I thought about our penthouse with its keypad entry and doorman security. It had always felt like a fortress, but now I realized it could just as easily become a trap. "I'll figure something out," I said. Alex reached across the table and took my hand. "Maya, I know this is overwhelming, but you're not alone in this. Whatever you need, financial analysis, safe places to stay, legal connections, I'm here." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That evening, I attended a charity fundraiser for the Seattle Art Museum, an event I'd helped coordinate 6 months earlier. Under normal circumstances, I would have enjoyed seeing my work come to fruition, watching 500 of Seattle's most influential people gather in support of arts education. Tonight, it felt like walking through a minefield. David was supposed to accompany me, but he'd canceled at the last minute. Another emergency at Morrison & Associates. I found myself standing in the museum's grand atrium, surrounded by people I'd known for years, feeling utterly alone. Maya, Eleanor Sterling, materialized beside me like an elegant apparition. David's mother was 72 years old and looked at least 15 years younger, thanks to excellent genetics, better skincare, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from never having worried about money. "You look beautiful, dear. Where's David?" "Working." I said the lie coming automatically. "Big case at the firm." Eleanor's expression tightened slightly. "Richard Morrison has been working his associates very hard lately. I worry that the firm is becoming too focused on profit and not enough on professional ethics." Something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. Eleanor Sterling was old Seattle society, the kind of woman who knew everyone's secrets and rarely spoke without purpose. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Oh, just office gossip," she said airily. "But I've heard some concerning things about the firm's recent cases, clients who've been, let's say, less than forthcoming about their circumstances." Before I could ask for clarification, Eleanor was swept away by other guests, leaving me standing in the middle of the crowded atrium with a new puzzle to solve. Did David's own mother suspect something was wrong at Morrison & Associates? The next few days passed in a blur of wedding preparations and investigation anxiety. The Hartwell wedding was scheduled for Saturday, and Sterling Occasions was in full crisis management mode. 3 days of events for 300 guests, with every detail scrutinized by a client who'd made his fortune in software and approached his daughter's wedding with the same attention to detail he'd bring to a product launch. But even as I coordinated with caterers and florists, confirmed transportation schedules, and reviewed emergency protocols, part of my mind was focused on Jake Morrison's investigation and the growing mountain of evidence that my husband was involved in organized fraud. Jake called on Thursday with an update that made my stomach drop. "Mrs. Sterling, we need to meet. I found something that changes everything." We met that evening at a coffee shop in Fremont, far from downtown and the legal district where David worked. Jake looked grim as he slid a manila folder across the table. "Your husband isn't just stealing from you," he said without preamble. "He's stealing from clients, too. Morrison & Associates has been running what amounts to a criminal enterprise, and David is one of their top earners." I opened the folder to find photographs, financial documents, and what appeared to be surveillance transcripts. The photographs showed David and Victoria, but also David with other people I didn't recognize. Men in expensive suits, women with the kind of polished appearance that suggested wealth and sophistication. "Who are these people?" I asked. "Clients. Wealthy individuals going through divorces who've paid Morrison and Associates premium fees to help them hide assets from their spouses. Your husband specializes in what they call strategic matrimonial dissolution. Basically, he's a divorce terrorist for hire." The clinical language couldn't hide the ugly reality of what Jake was describing. David wasn't just cheating on me, he was making a living by helping other people destroy their marriages for financial gain. "How many cases?" I asked. "At least a dozen in the past 2 years, maybe more. The firm has been very careful about documentation, but we've identified at least $15 million in assets that have been moved through questionable transfers." I stared at the photographs, trying to reconcile the man I'd married with this criminal version of him. "What about Victoria? Is she involved?" "Up to her neck. Victoria Chen, no relation to you despite the shared surname, is Richard Morrison's niece. She's not just David's girlfriend, she's his business partner. They've been working together to identify high-value targets and develop strategies for asset stripping." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Victoria wasn't just the other woman. She was David's criminal collaborator. Their relationship wasn't a romantic affair that had gotten complicated by professional boundaries. It was a business partnership that used romance as a cover. "There's something else," Jake continued. "We intercepted communication suggesting that you were never just David's wife. You were his practice case, the techniques he's been using on you, the financial manipulation, the psychological warfare, the systematic isolation. He's refined those methods and started selling them to other clients." I felt nauseous. "You're saying he married me to what experiment?" "I'm saying David Sterling identified you as a high-value target 9 years ago. A successful business owner with significant assets and no family support system. The romance, the marriage, the gradual financial integration. It was all part of a long-term strategy to position himself to take everything you'd built." The coffee shop seemed to spin around me as Jake's words sank in. My entire adult life, my marriage, my trust, my love, it had all been part of an elaborate confidence game. "Mrs. Sterling," Jake said gently, "I know this is overwhelming, but you need to understand that you're not just a victim here. You're evidence. What David has done to you is the prototype for what he's been doing to other people. Your case could be the key to bringing down the entire operation." I managed to nod, though I felt like I was drowning. "What happens now?" "Now we document everything and we prepare for war. Because when David and his associates realize what we know, they're going to do everything they can to discredit you, destroy the evidence, and disappear with the money they've stolen." I drove home that night in a daze, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. David wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a career criminal who targeted me from the beginning. Our entire relationship had been built on lies, manipulation, and theft. But as devastating as that knowledge was, it also crystallized something important. I was done being a victim. By the time I reached our penthouse, I'd made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to wait for Jake's investigation to reach its conclusion. I wasn't going to hide in coffee shops and gather evidence in secret. I was going to take the fight directly to David Sterling and Morrison and Associates, and I was going to make sure that everyone who'd been hurt by their criminal enterprise got justice. The Hartwell wedding was in 2 days. 300 of Seattle's most influential people would be gathered in one place, including several clients and colleagues from Morrison and Associates. It would be the perfect venue for the kind of public revelation that would ensure David and his associates couldn't simply disappear into obscurity. I was going to turn the most important event of my professional career into the stage for David Sterling's complete destruction. Some revenge, I realized, is best served in front of an audience. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel sparkled like a jewel in downtown Seattle's crown as I walked through the grand lobby at 7 a.m. on Saturday morning. The Hartwell wedding would begin in 12 hours, and Sterling occasions had transformed the historic hotel into a 3-day celebration that would be talked about for years. What the guests didn't know was that they were about to witness more than a wedding. They were about to see justice served. I'd spent the past 2 days in careful preparation working with Jake Morrison, my brother Alex, and a federal prosecutor named Sarah Kim, who specialized in organized financial crimes. Sarah had been Alex's roommate at the University of Washington, and when he'd called her about my case, she'd immediately recognized the potential for a major racketeering prosecution. Mrs. Sterling, Sarah had told me during our meeting yesterday, what you've uncovered could be the biggest matrimonial fraud case in federal history. But we need to do this right. One mistake and these people could disappear with evidence and money we'll never recover. The plan we'd developed was elegant in its simplicity. The Hartwell wedding reception would include several Morrison and Associates clients and colleagues, people who were either victims of the firm's criminal activities or participants in them. Among the guest list were Victoria Chen, Richard Morrison himself, and of course David. David had been surprised when I'd insisted he attend the wedding with me. "I thought you were going to be too busy working to want me there," he'd said, his tone suggesting he'd been hoping to skip the event entirely. "It's the biggest event of the year for Sterling occasions," I'd replied. "I want my husband beside me when I celebrate this achievement." Husband. The word felt like ash in my mouth, but David had smiled with what looked like genuine pleasure. Even now, even knowing what he was part of, him seemed to crave the appearance of a successful marriage. I arrived at the hotel early to oversee final preparations, but also to ensure that the additional security measures Sarah Kim had arranged were properly in place. Federal agents would be stationed throughout the hotel disguised as catering staff and wedding vendors. Recording equipment had been installed in the main ballroom, and every entrance and exit would be monitored. "You understand that once this starts, there's no going back," Sarah had warned me. "David and his associates will know you've been investigating them, and they'll do everything they can to destroy your credibility and potentially harm you physically. Are you prepared for that?" I'd thought about my great-great-grandmother Lee May arriving in America with nothing but hope and a sapphire necklace. About my parents who'd lost everything to financial fraud, but had still taught me to stand up for what was right. About all the victims of David's schemes who'd never had the resources or knowledge to fight back. "I'm prepared," I'd told Sarah. And I was. The wedding ceremony went flawlessly. Jennifer Hartwell looked radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown as she married her college sweetheart in the hotel's Spanish ballroom. 300 guests witnessed their vows, including several people who had no idea they were about to become witnesses to something far more dramatic. David arrived just before the ceremony began, looking handsome in his tailored tuxedo and wearing the smile that had once made my heart skip. He found me in the back of the ballroom, coordinating with the photographer, and slipped his arm around my waist. "Everything looks perfect," he murmured in my ear. "You've outdone yourself, Maya." I leaned into him, playing the part of the proud wife one last time. "Thank you for being here. I know work has been overwhelming lately." "I wouldn't miss it," he said, and for a moment I almost believed him. The cocktail reception that followed the ceremony was held in the hotel's Georgian room, an elegant space with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. I moved through the crowd with practiced ease, checking on vendors, greeting guests, and maintaining the perfect facade of the successful event planner celebrating her greatest achievement. But I was also watching. Victoria Chen stood near the bar, stunning in a midnight blue gown that perfectly complemented her dark hair. She was laughing with Richard Morrison, a distinguished man in his 70s, whose silver hair and expensive suit couldn't quite hide the calculating coldness in his eyes. Other faces I recognized from Jake's investigation were scattered throughout the crowd. Wealthy clients who'd paid Morrison and Associates to help them steal from their spouses, associates who'd participated in the firm's criminal activities, victims who'd been destroyed by the very people they'd trusted to represent them legally. "Maya." Eleanor Sterling appeared beside me, elegant in champagne silk and pearls. "The ceremony was beautiful. You should be very proud." "Thank you, Eleanor. I'm glad you could be here." David's mother studied my face with the kind of attention that suggested she saw more than I was saying. "My dear, are you quite all right? You seem tense." Before I could answer, David appeared with Victoria at his side. "Mother," he said, kissing Eleanor's cheek, "I'd like you to meet Victoria Chen. She's been working with me on the Morrison Industries acquisition." I watched the lie roll off his tongue with practiced ease. Victoria extended her hand to Eleanor with a brilliant smile, playing her role perfectly. "Mrs. Sterling, it's such a pleasure to meet you," Victoria said. "David has told me so much about you." "Has he?" Eleanor's tone was polite but cool. "How interesting. I don't recall David mentioning you." The subtle tension in that exchange wasn't lost on any of us. Eleanor Sterling might not know the specific details of her son's betrayal, but her social radar was finely tuned enough to sense when something was wrong. Victoria has been invaluable to the Morrison Industries case. David set his hand, resting possessively on Victoria's lower back. "I don't know what we would have done without her expertise." I felt something snap inside me as I watched my husband touch another woman with casual intimacy while introducing her to his mother as a business colleague. The months of lies, the stolen money, the systematic destruction of our marriage. It all crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. "Victoria," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the elegant space, "that's a beautiful necklace you're wearing." Victoria's hand flew to her throat, where my great-great-grandmother's sapphire necklace caught the light from the crystal chandeliers. She'd been wearing it under her dress, but the clasp had shifted, making the distinctive antique setting visible. "Thank you," she said, her composure faltering slightly. "It was a gift." "How lovely!" I continued, stepping closer. "The sapphires look very old. Antique, I'd say, possibly late 19th century based on the setting." David's face had gone pale, but he was trapped by social convention and the presence of his mother. He couldn't stop this conversation without creating exactly the kind of scene he'd been trying to avoid. "Maya has quite an eye for jewelry," he said, his voice tight. "Professional hazard of event planning." "Actually," I said, reaching into my evening bag, "I have something that might interest you, Victoria." I withdrew a small velvet box and opened it to reveal the diamond ring I'd found in David's jacket pocket weeks earlier. The emerald-cut stone caught the light exactly as it had that first devastating afternoon. "This ring was meant for someone special," I announced, my voice carrying to the guests around us. "Someone whose initial is V. Perhaps you know who that might be." The conversation around us had begun to quiet as people sensed drama unfolding. Victoria's eyes were fixed on the ring with an expression of desperate longing, while David looked like he was calculating escape routes. "Maya," he said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Oh, I think this is exactly the right time and place," I replied. "After all, when better to celebrate love than at a wedding? David, would you like to do the honors, or shall I?" Before he could respond, I turned to face the crowd that had gathered around us. In the sudden hush, my voice carried clearly throughout the Georgian room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll indulge me for just a moment. I have a special announcement to make." The entire reception fell silent. 300 guests turned their attention to our small group, and I felt the weight of their collective gaze. Somewhere in that crowd, federal agents were recording every word. Sarah Kim was watching from her position near the hotel's main entrance. Jake Morrison was stationed by the windows, ready to prevent anyone from leaving. This was it. The moment that would either destroy my life completely or begin my journey toward justice. 9 years ago, I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I married a man I thought was the love of my life. David Sterling swept me off my feet with his charm, his intelligence, and his apparent devotion. He supported my dream of starting my own business. He integrated our finances, our lives, our futures. He convinced me that we were partners in everything. David was staring at me with a mixture of horror and calculation, clearly trying to decide whether to interrupt or let me finish. What I didn't know, I continued, was that David Sterling is a criminal. What I didn't know was that Morrison & Associates operates as a criminal enterprise, helping wealthy clients steal millions of dollars from their spouses. What I didn't know was that my husband had targeted me from the beginning as a high-value victim whose assets could be systematically stolen. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. I saw Richard Morrison push through the guests toward the exit, only to be quietly intercepted by two men in catering uniforms who were clearly federal agents. "Maya, stop!" David said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. "You don't understand what you're doing." "Oh, but I do," I replied. "I understand that you've stolen $300,000 from our joint accounts. I understand that you've been having an affair with Victoria Chen for over a year. I understand that Victoria is wearing my great-great-grandmother's sapphire necklace, which you told me was safely stored in your office." Victoria's hand went to the necklace again, and I saw genuine panic in her eyes for the first time. But most importantly, I continued raising my voice so every person in that room could hear me clearly. "I understand that you and Victoria have been documenting your crimes thinking you were so much smarter than your victims. What you didn't realize is that those same records have been turned over to federal prosecutors, along with evidence of at least $15 million in fraud committed by Morrison and Associates." The room exploded into chaos. Guests were pulling out phones recording everything. Hotel security was trying to maintain order, while federal agents moved through the crowd identifying suspects and preventing escapes. David grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin with enough force to leave bruises. "You stupid bitch!" he hissed, all pretense of charm finally dropping away. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Do you know what these people are capable of? Let go of my daughter-in-law immediately." Eleanor Sterling's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. She stood behind David, her social poise replaced by the kind of cold fury that comes from a lifetime of wielding real power. "David," she said, her voice deadly quiet, "release Maya's arm and step away from her, now." Something in his mother's tone must have penetrated David's panic because he dropped his hand and stepped back. But the damage was done. His threat, his physical aggression, his complete abandonment of the caring husband facade, it had all been captured by dozens of phones and the federal recording equipment. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, "I apologize for disrupting this beautiful celebration. But I wanted you all to witness the moment when David Sterling and Victoria Chen learned that their crimes have consequences." That's when Sarah Kim stepped forward, flanked by federal agents. "David Sterling and Victoria Chen," she announced, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and racketeering." The next few minutes were a blur of handcuffs, Miranda rights, and controlled chaos as federal agents arrested not just David and Victoria, but Richard Morrison and 3 other Morrison and Associates colleagues who'd been identified as part of the criminal enterprise. I stood in the center of it all, feeling strangely calm as I watched my husband being led away in handcuffs. He turned back once his face twisted with rage and something that might have been genuine grief. "Maya," he called out, "this isn't over. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've started." I met his eyes across the crowded room and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "David," I replied loud enough for everyone to hear, "I know exactly what I've started. I've started the process of making sure that every person you've hurt gets justice." As the federal agents led David and Victoria out of the Georgian room, Eleanor Sterling approached me. The older woman's composure was remarkable considering she'd just watched her son arrested for federal crimes. "Maya," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I suspected something was wrong at the firm, but I never imagined this." "You don't owe me anything, Eleanor. If anything, I'm sorry you had to learn about David's crimes this way." Eleanor studied my face for a long moment. "You planned this entire confrontation, didn't you? The wedding, the public venue, the federal agents? You orchestrated all of it." "I did." "Good," Eleanor said firmly. "David made his choices. Now he'll face the consequences. And Maya, if you need anything, legal support, financial assistance, character witnesses, you call me immediately." The unexpected support from David's own mother was almost more overwhelming than everything else that had happened. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. The Hartwell wedding reception continued, though the mood had shifted dramatically. The bride and groom, to their credit, seemed more fascinated than upset by the evening's unexpected turn. Several guests approached me to offer support or ask questions about the case that would clearly dominate Seattle's social conversation for months to come. But the most meaningful moment came when Jake Morrison appeared at my side. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, "or would you prefer Ms. Chen now?" "Maya," I said. "Just Maya." "Maya, then. I wanted you to know that the arrests went perfectly. We have enough evidence to put David and his associates away for decades. The federal prosecutor is confident about convictions, and the asset recovery team thinks they can trace most of the stolen money." "What about the other victims?" "There will be a massive investigation, probably lasting years. But tonight's arrests have already triggered federal task forces in 3 other states. You've potentially saved dozens of families from financial ruin." I looked around the Georgian room at the elegant guests and beautiful decorations, at the remnants of what should have been a simple wedding reception. Instead, it had become the stage for one of the most dramatic confrontations of my life. "Jake," I said, "do you think David was right when he said this wasn't over?" Jake's expression grew serious. "Maya, you've just brought down a criminal organization that was stealing millions of dollars. There will be investigations, trials, appeals, civil suits. It's going to be years before this is truly finished. But the hardest part, the part that required real courage, that's done. You stood up when it mattered most." 6 months later, I stood in the renovated offices of Chen Occasions, my renamed and expanded event planning company. The Hartwell wedding exposure had brought me more business than I could handle, as clients were drawn to the woman who'd taken down a criminal conspiracy. David had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Victoria received 12 years. Richard Morrison got 25 years and the complete dissolution of Morrison and Associates. In total, 18 people were arrested and over $30 million in assets were recovered for victims. The sapphire necklace was returned to me during the asset recovery process, though it took several months to work through the legal complications. When I finally held it again, feeling the familiar weight of 4 generations of strong women around my neck, I understood something my great-great-grandmother Lee May had always known. Sometimes the only way to reclaim what's yours is to fight for it publicly, completely, and without compromise. My phone rang, interrupting my reflection. The caller ID showed a number I'd been expecting. "Maya, this is Jennifer Hartwell. Well, Jennifer Morrison now." I smiled. Jennifer and her husband had become friends over the months following their wedding, bonding over the shared experience of having their special day turned into federal crime fighting. "Jennifer, how are you?" "How's married life?" "Wonderful, actually. But I'm calling because Tom and I have a proposition for you. We're starting a foundation to help victims of financial fraud, and we want you to be our first board member." I looked out of the window of my new office across Elliott Bay toward the mountains and felt something settle into place. David had thought he was destroying my life when he'd targeted me 9 years ago. Instead, he'd created someone who understood exactly how to fight back against people like him. "I'd be honored," I told Jennifer. "When do we start?" "Some stories end with revenge. Others end with justice. The best ones end with transformation, not just of the victim, but of the entire system that allowed the crime to happen in the first place." My great-great-grandmother's sapphire necklace had seen 4 generations of Chen women through their darkest moments. Now it would witness something new, a Chen woman who'd turned her darkest moment into the foundation for protecting others. David Sterling had taught me that sometimes the people you trust most are the ones most capable of betraying you. But he'd also taught me something more valuable, that the strength to fight back had been inside me all along. I just had to be willing to use it.